We now move on to what we've called the secular ways, or the ways of civilizational progress. Unlike the axial traditions, which regard spiritual self-cultivation as differently as they may have understood it, as the principal aim of human life, the secular ways focus primarily on interworldly action, whether technological, economic, political, or cultural, leading to civilizational progress. We begin by discussing the Protestant tradition, which we call theistic secularism. This term may seem like an oxymoron. How can a secularism be theistic? The answer is in a proper understanding of the secular. Secularism does not exclude a belief in God any more than otherworldliness excludes a rejection of the existence of God, as we saw with Buddhism. Secularism, at least as we will use the term, simply entails a commitment to the view that the primary locus of meaning is in this world. As we will see, Protestantism fully meets this criterion, though different strains of Protestantism meet it in somewhat different ways. It is quite impossible to understand Protestantism apart from the Germanic matrix out of which it emerged. We have already discussed the Germanic appropriation of Christianity. Central to Germanic society was the relationship between the war leader and his retainers. Warriors legitimated themselves by winning and distributing the spoils of war among their followers, a process which led to the development of a loose and informal hierarchy of warrior nobles, ruling over a peasant population which they at once exploited and protected. The central relationship within this system was the pledge of fealty which bound a man to his lord and a lord to his overlord. In return for this fidelity and service, the lord was bound to share freely what he won for his men. Germanic war leaders also performed sacrifices on behalf of the communities they led. This said, it is worth noting that among the Germanic deities there is one who stands out as being more nearly a god of wisdom than of warfare, though he is in some measure both. This is Odin, who is said to have discovered the wisdom of the runes after sacrificing himself by hanging on the world tree, or Yggdrasil. In this context, Jesus was understood first and foremost as a warrior who does battle with Satan, much as Beowulf does battle with Grendel and binds him deep in hell. He then bestows his booty, which is salvation, as a free gift on those who have been faithful to him. To the extent that wisdom plays a role in the emerging Germanic spiritual ideal, it is not the acquired wisdom of the Greeks, achieved by means of rational dialectics, but rather the supernatural, almost shamanic wisdom of the dying and rising Odin, who learns the runes while hanging on the tree, access to which is possible only through a personal relationship with him. This led to a fundamentally different kind of spirituality. If God is an infinitely powerful being who we must obey, rather than the power of being as such in which we participate, then our desire to become God is no longer a healthy and proper spiritual dynamic, which will bear fruit in generative action towards our neighbors, but rather an act of disobedience and rebellion. Good works, which make us more like God, are just an expression of this rebellion and contribute nothing to our salvation. This is the basis of Luther's theology. This is the basis of his conviction that human beings are radically depraved, and that justification or reconciliation of God is not possible on the basis of works, through which, in striving to grow towards God, we are ultimately just engaged in self-aggrandizing behavior. Faith alone, which joins us to the perfect sacrifice, that of Christ crucified, can render us just. There is, furthermore, for Luther, no way to build a just social order on the basis of this perfect sacrifice. Make it a requirement of the law, and the message of forgiveness is lost, and the offer of free grace implicit in the sacrifice deformed. Let the law go into abeyance, and injustice goes unpunished and ultimately triumphs. Calvin carried this kind of reasoning even further. Calvinism is defined by 5 principal doctrines. First, human beings are totally depraved, incapable, for the reasons cited above, of action meriting salvation. Second, God unconditionally elects or chooses those who are to be saved before the foundations of the world, without respect to any foreknowledge of their merit. Third, Jesus died only for this group of the elect, not for humanity as a whole. Fourth, once God has chosen us, we have no choice but to be saved. Grace is irresistible. And fifth, once we are saved, we cannot fall back into damnation. This is known as the perseverance of the saints. Sociologist Max Weber argued that Calvinism created an ideological and psychological situation uniquely favorable to industrialization and capitalist development. On the one hand, Calvinism regarded all useful work, not just specifically religious work, as an expression of God's will in the world. On the other hand, the fact that such work was a probable, but only probable, sign of election created a profound psychological tension which favored hard work, investment, and accumulation. If I work hard, I might be among the elect. If I am lazy, I know I am damned. If I save and invest so that my work serves the common good, I might be among the elect. If I consume what I produce, then I know that I am damned. We can see then how, in the context of the Protestant Reformation, the focus shifted from spiritual self-cultivation, which was regarded as in fact selfish behavior and contrary to God's work of redemption, and instead to the inner worldly activity, and particularly to the productive activity of emerging capitalism, which was regarded as a sign of God's work in the world, a sign that God was working through us to build his kingdom. Calvinists were in fact divided in the ways in which they sought clues about their spiritual condition. Some, the ancestors of today's liberal Protestants, stressed usefulness to the community, something which some in turn understood to mean primarily productivity in the economic arena, and others to mean a concern for promoting religion and social justice. At its far end, liberal Protestantism gradually evolved away from many historic tenets of Christianity, including the divinity of Jesus, and gave birth to Unitarianism. Others, who became known as evangelicals, stressed the need for a convincing narrative of a personal conversion experience. Evangelicals, while united in stressing the importance of personal conversion, were in turn divided between the high Calvinists, and especially the New Divinity movement, who believed that conversion had to bear fruit in ethical conduct and social reform, and what was originally a relatively small group of backcountry revivalists who stressed a more purely emotional conversion experience, and for the most part gradually abandoned, at least in practice, their adherence to Calvinist distinctives such as limited atonement and double predestination. Most American evangelicals up until the Civil War were postmillennialists and regarded the creation of a just social order as the essential precondition of the second coming of Christ, and as an integral part of God's work of redemption. The struggle against slavery was seen as the leading edge of that process. God really was sifting out the nations beneath his judgment seat, and the Union armies were to be the agents of that judgment. This was true for both liberals and evangelicals. The disillusionment which resulted when Reconstruction gave way to industrialization and capitalist development in the North and to Jim Crow in the South was catastrophic for this movement. When the promised redemption failed to take place, the old Evangelical United Front gradually began to dissolve, with some drifting towards the liberal gradualism which eventually became the social gospel movement, and others abandoning their postmillennial eschatology in favor of what eventually emerged as modern fundamentalism. This new fundamentalist evangelicalism was based on a dispensational premillennial eschatology. According to this view, God deals differently with humanity during different periods. The ministry of Jesus up to the time of his crucifixion was part of the dispensation of the law, and Jesus' moral teachings, with their profound social implications, are essentially part of a superseded Judaism. Humanity is now living in the age of grace, where salvation is by faith, not works. What is more, rather than leading naturally to moral uplift and social reform, personal conversion really has no visible moral or social effects. Far from looking forward to the creation of a just society, this new fundamentalism expected the world to get worse and worse until Jesus came to rapture the elect and redeem the world. This new fundamentalism had a social basis as well, which was quite different from that of the old Evangelical United Front. While evangelicalism had always spoken to those who were left behind, it did so at least in part because it promised a better world, and not just in the beyond. Evangelicalism had been, in other words, an ideology of those who hoped to make America keep its promises. In this regard, it overlapped very substantially with liberal Protestant reformism. Now, increasingly, it spoke to those who recognized that high modernity, they never said America or capitalism, had no use for them and their way of life, and who felt, furthermore, that the proposals of liberal reformers and socialists, far from offering a more humane modernity, simply promised a more vigorous effort to extinguish their way of life. For broad layers of the rural population in the South and West, and for the petty bourgeoisie and even small capitalists of the smaller cities and towns, progress, whether understood in the capitalist or socialist sense, meant only further attacks on their way of life. And so they dug in their heels and resisted and waited for Jesus. They are still waiting. It should be noted that even if it has given up hope in creating a just society, fundamentalism remains modern and secular in important ways. Ancient and medieval religions would never have thought of interpreting their scriptures literally, especially texts such as Genesis, which St. Augustine, already in the 4th century, insisted was an allegory. Fundamentalists accept the modern empiricist view that knowledge is knowledge of facts and events. If the Bible is not literally true, then it is not true at all, a conclusion they are unwilling to accept. And for fundamentalism, there is only one world, this one. If Jesus is returning, that means he will return in a literal, physically visible way to this world. To interpret language around this kingdom as a metaphor for the creation of a just society, or even as referring to a union with the divine outside of space and time, as for the Catholic tradition, is the same thing as saying that Jesus isn't coming back at all. The one really significant exception to this pattern was the African American Church. The African American Church, alone among the members of the old Evangelical United Front, have retained both their evangelicalism and their commitment to social reform. Black evangelicalism has, to be sure, always been different from its white counterpart. As Eugene Genovese pointed out long ago, African Americans never really bought into the doctrines of original sin and double predestination. The black community has, however, always had a deep sense of the degrading effects of oppression on personal morality. Personal conversion in this context means getting your act together and learning to live productively and creatively in the world as it is, while struggling to create the world as it could and should be. The result has been that African Americans, though more than willing to point out the shortcomings of the United States, are perhaps more than any other group in the country true believers in America, and are so in more nearly the classical Puritan sense than any other ethno-religious community. As anyone who has attempted to organize in the African American community has discovered, it is one thing to call America to task for her sins. It is quite another to attack the American ideal. When African Americans have called the American ideal into question, this has usually involved an explicit break with Christianity, something which can be made explicit only by opting for another and historically distinct religion, such as Islam.